She won't have any say in what happens after today, my daughter-in-law whispered to someone just a few seats away from me, convinced I couldn't hear her. The words settled over the room like a cold draft. I sat quietly in the front row of the attorney's conference room, my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring at the polished oak table where my late husband's will would soon be read. My name is Margaret Callahan. I was 72 years old, and 3 weeks earlier, I had buried my husband of 42 years. The grief still followed me everywhere. It lingered in the silence of our bedroom, in the empty chair at the breakfast table, and in the unopened books resting on his nightstand. But that morning, as I looked around the room, I realized grief was not the only thing waiting for me. My son Daniel sat across from me, scrolling through his phone. He barely glanced in my direction. Beside him, his wife Heather looked unusually cheerful for a woman attending a family legal meeting. She wore a cream-colored blazer and a smile she tried very hard to hide. Every few minutes, she exchanged knowing looks with other relatives. The atmosphere felt wrong. Not solemn, not respectful, expectant, as though everyone had arrived for the same reason people gather before fireworks. They were waiting for something exciting to happen. I recognized several cousins, a nephew, and even a distant relative who had rarely visited my husband while he was alive. Yet somehow they all found time to attend the reading of his will. Funny how loss attracts people when money might be involved. Thomas Bennett, my husband's longtime attorney, organized several folders at the head of the table. His expression remained professional, though when our eyes met, I thought I detected something else. Concern, perhaps, or caution. Heather leaned toward Daniel and whispered something. He nodded without looking up. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it told me everything I needed to know. They already believed they understood how this day would end. They believed they had won before the meeting even began. For months before my husband passed away, I had noticed subtle changes. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Questions about property values disguised as casual curiosity. Discussions about renovations to a house that did not belong to them. I told myself I was imagining things. Families become awkward around illness. People say strange things when they fear the future. But now, sitting in that room, watching Heather struggle to contain her excitement, I wondered if I had been ignoring something much larger. The conference room overlooked downtown Columbus through floor-to-ceiling windows. Cars moved steadily below. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued as normal outside. Inside, however, an invisible contest seemed to be unfolding. I could almost feel the assumptions hanging in the air. The grieving widow, the elderly mother, the woman everyone expected to quietly step aside. Heather finally looked directly at me. Her smile widened ever so slightly. It wasn't cruel enough to draw attention, just confident enough to reveal what she was thinking. In her mind, I was already powerless, a relic of a previous chapter, someone whose role in the family story had ended. I returned her smile. That seemed to surprise her. Thomas cleared his throat and opened the first folder. Conversations stopped immediately. Chairs shifted. Every eye turned toward him. The room fell silent. I folded my hands more tightly and took a slow breath. Whatever was inside those documents, my husband had left it there for a reason. And despite what everyone around me seemed to believe, I trusted him completely. They thought I was walking into that room with nothing left. They thought grief had made me weak. They thought I was about to lose the last piece of my place in this family. They could not have been more mistaken. 3 weeks earlier, the house had become quieter than I ever thought possible. After 42 years of marriage, silence felt unnatural. Every room seemed larger without my husband. The grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder. The refrigerator hummed like a distant engine. Even the floorboards seemed to creak differently. I woke up every morning at 6 because that was when Robert always made coffee. For the first few days after the funeral, I still found myself listening for the familiar sounds of cabinet doors opening and coffee beans being ground in the kitchen. Then I would remember. The realization never arrived gently. It came like cold water every single time. One morning, I carried my coffee to the back porch and sat in the wooden chair Robert had built 10 years earlier. The October air was crisp. A few leaves drifted across the yard. Our maple tree had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Robert used to say it looked like the tree was celebrating autumn. That morning, it felt more like it was mourning with me. Daniel and Heather had been staying at the house more often since the funeral. At first I appreciated the company. Everyone told me I should not be alone. They offered help with groceries, paperwork, and household chores. I was grateful. At least, I wanted to be. But little things began to change. Heather started answering questions that were directed at me. Delivery drivers would ask where a package should go, and she would answer before I could speak. Contractors called about routine maintenance, and somehow Heather always inserted herself into the conversation. Daniel was changing too. My son had always been thoughtful, even when life became busy. Yet after his father passed away, he seemed distracted whenever I spoke. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact became rarer. Sometimes I would enter a room and feel as though I had interrupted something. One afternoon, I noticed several folders spread across the dining room table. Real estate documents, tax records, utility statements. Heather quickly gathered them when she saw me approaching. "Just trying to help organize everything," she said with a bright smile. I nodded and said nothing. Later that evening, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the guest bedroom. Their voices drifted through the partially closed door. I was not trying to eavesdrop. I had simply been walking past. "The house alone is worth more than I thought," Heather said. There was a pause. Then Daniel replied, "Let us just get through the will reading first." I froze. My hand tightened around the hallway railing. Neither of them mentioned me. Not once. They spoke about timelines, expenses, future plans. The conversation sounded less like concern for family and more like preparation for a business transaction. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling and replayed every strange interaction from the previous weeks. The interrupted conversations, the hidden paperwork, the confident smiles. One memory kept returning. A few days after the funeral, Heather had asked whether I planned to keep living in the house long term. At the time, I assumed she was worried about me managing such a large property alone. Now I was not so sure. The next morning, I walked through the house slowly. Family photographs lined the hallway walls. Birthdays, vacations, graduations. 42 years of memories surrounded me. Yet for the first time, I felt like a visitor inside my own home. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet question began to form. What exactly were Daniel and Heather expecting to happen after the will was read? The question stayed with me for days. I did not ask Daniel about it. I did not confront Heather. At my age, I had learned that people often reveal more when they believe no one is paying attention. Instead, I watched. I listened. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. A week before the will reading, Daniel suggested we have dinner together. He said it would be good for all of us to spend time as a family. The invitation sounded thoughtful, and for a moment, I felt relieved. Perhaps I had been imagining the tension. Perhaps grief was making me suspicious. That evening, I prepared one of Daniel's favorite meals. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh dinner rolls. The same meal I had made for birthdays and family gatherings for years. The familiar routine brought me comfort. For a few hours, the house almost felt normal again. When they arrived, Heather carried a bottle of sparkling cider and greeted me with unusual warmth. Daniel hugged me briefly before sitting down. Everything seemed pleasant at first. We talked about the weather, Emily's new apartment, and a local restaurant that had recently opened downtown. Yet beneath the conversation, something felt rehearsed. Every topic remained safely on the surface. No one mentioned Robert. No one spoke about the future. No one spoke about the will. Then Heather asked a question that changed the entire evening. "Have you thought about downsizing?" she said casually while reaching for the rolls. I looked up from my plate. "Downsizing? The house is pretty large for one person," she replied with a smile. "All those stairs, all that maintenance." Daniel immediately nodded. It could be difficult to manage long term. The words themselves were reasonable. What unsettled me was how quickly they agreed with each other, almost as if they had practiced the conversation beforehand. I set down my fork. "I have lived here for more than 30 years, I said. "I know every inch of this house." Heather laughed softly. "Of course. We are just thinking about what might be easiest for you." Easiest for me. The phrase lingered in my mind long after dinner ended. 2 days later, another incident occurred. I came downstairs one morning and found Heather standing in the living room, taking photographs with her phone. She looked startled when she noticed me. "I was just showing a friend how beautiful the house is," she explained. Her answer arrived too quickly. Later that afternoon, I discovered a notebook on the kitchen counter. It belonged to Daniel. I was not searching through his belongings. It had been left open. My eyes caught a few words before I could look away. Estimated value. property taxes, renovation costs. There were figures written beside each note. Numbers, calculations, plans. That evening, I sat alone on the back porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The air smelled of fallen leaves and distant fireplaces. I thought about Robert, about the life we had built together, about every sacrifice, every mortgage payment, every dream that had turned this house into a home. Suddenly, I understood what troubled me most. Daniel and Heather were no longer speaking as family members. They were speaking as future owners. And for the first time, I began to suspect that they had already decided what would happen after the will was read. The only problem was that no one had bothered to tell me. That realization brought back a memory I had not thought about in weeks. It happened 6 months before Robert passed away. At the time, it seemed like an ordinary afternoon. We were sitting on the back porch together, watching a summer storm move across the horizon. The sky was darkening, but neither of us wanted to go inside yet. Robert always loved watching the weather. He said storms reminded him that some things in life could not be controlled, only respected. He held a mug of coffee in both hands and stared out at the yard for a long time before speaking. "Margaret," he said quietly, "if anything ever happens to me, promise me you will not let anyone pressure you into making decisions too quickly." I laughed softly. Who would pressure me? He did not answer right away. Instead, he took another sip of coffee and continued watching the clouds. "Just promise me." I remember teasing him for sounding mysterious. He smiled, but there was something unusual in his expression, a seriousness that did not match the conversation. "You know me," I said. "I am not easily pushed around." "I know," he replied. "That is exactly why I am asking." At the time, I assumed he was worried about my future. We were both getting older. Conversations about aging appeared more frequently. Medical appointments, retirement plans, long-term care insurance. The practical realities that eventually find every married couple. Looking back, I realized that conversation had been different. Robert was not speaking about the future in general. He was speaking about something specific. A few weeks after that afternoon, I noticed him spending more time in his home office. Sometimes he would be on the phone with Thomas Bennett for nearly an hour. Other times he would leave the house carrying folders and return later with a thoughtful expression. Whenever I asked what he was working on, he smiled and told me not to worry. "Just taking care of a few things," he would say. I trusted him completely, so I never pressed for details. One evening, about 3 months before he passed away, I walked into the office carrying a plate of sandwiches. Robert quickly closed a folder. Before I reached his desk, the movement was subtle, but I noticed it. "What is so important?" I asked with a grin. "Nothing exciting," he replied. "Just paperwork." Then he reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. The kind of paperwork that helps me sleep better at night. At the time, I thought little of it. Now, sitting alone in the house after his funeral, those memories felt different. Each one seemed connected to the next like pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. The strongest memory came from the final week we spent together. Robert was tired that day. The illness had taken much of his strength, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. I was helping him organize a drawer beside the bed when he suddenly looked at me and said, "Whatever happens later, trust the papers." I smiled and told him he was speaking in riddles again. He smiled back. "Maybe, but promise me anyway." "I promise," I said. He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. At the time, I believed the conversation was simply another expression of his desire to take care of me. Now, as Daniel and Heather continued behaving like people already planning their future inheritance, those words echoed in my mind with new meaning. Trust the papers. Robert had repeated that message more than once. And for the first time, I began to wonder if he had seen something long before I did. 2 days before the will reading, I received a phone call that changed the direction of my thoughts. The caller was Thomas Bennett. His voice was calm and professional, exactly as it had been for the 25 years I had known him. "Margaret, would you have time to stop by my office tomorrow morning?" he asked. "There are a few administrative details I would like to review before the family meeting." The request sounded ordinary enough, but something in his tone caught my attention. It was not urgency, it was caution. The next morning, I drove downtown and parked outside the same brick building where Robert and I had signed countless documents over the years. Estate planning, insurance forms, property records, the practical paperwork that quietly follows a lifetime together. Thomas greeted me warmly and led me. Into his office. Family photographs covered one wall. Law books filled another. The familiar surroundings helped settle my nerves. For several minutes, we discussed routine matters. Bank accounts, household records, contact information. Then Thomas removed his glasses and folded his hands on the desk. "Margaret," he said carefully, "Robert cared very deeply about making sure you would be protected." I smiled. "That sounds exactly like him." Thomas nodded. "Yes, it does." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair. Over the last year, Robert updated certain documents more than once. That surprised me. Robert had always been organized, but frequent changes were unusual. Was something wrong? I asked. Thomas considered his answer before speaking. "Let us just say that Robert paid very close attention to the people around him." The room suddenly felt quieter. I remembered the conversations on the porch, the late-night paperwork, the repeated reminders to trust the papers. Thomas was not revealing confidential details. I could tell he was being careful, yet his message was unmistakable. Robert had noticed things that perhaps I had overlooked. "Did he ever tell you why?" I asked softly. Thomas smiled. "Your husband was one of the most thoughtful men I have ever known. He believed preparation was an act of love." The word stayed with me. Preparation was an act of love. That sounded exactly like Robert. Before I left, Thomas walked me to the elevator. As the doors opened, he said something that seemed simple at the time. "Whatever happens at the meeting, remember that your husband trusted his decisions." I looked at him. That sounds like advice. A faint smile crossed his face. Perhaps it is. Driving home, I felt calmer than I had in weeks. Not because I knew what was in the will. I still had no idea. What changed was something else. For the first time since the funeral, I felt as though I was not standing alone. Someone else had witnessed Robert's intentions. Someone else understood how carefully he had planned. When I arrived home, I found Daniel and Heather sitting at the kitchen table. They stopped talking when I entered the room. Heather smiled brightly. Daniel looked uncomfortable. The silence lasted only a second, but it was enough. A few months earlier, I might have ignored it. Now I noticed everything. As I carried my purse upstairs, I heard Heather laugh softly behind me. It was the laugh of someone who believed the future had already been decided. I continued walking without turning around. Deep inside, a different feeling was beginning to grow. Not certainty, not victory, simply trust. Trust in Robert, trust in the choices he had made, and trust that the truth would reveal itself soon enough. The day before the family meeting, I noticed something that would have upset me deeply a month earlier. Instead, it simply confirmed what I already suspected. Heather was standing in the upstairs hallway holding a paint sample booklet. She did not know I was watching from the doorway of my bedroom. She moved slowly from room to room, studying the walls as though she were planning a renovation project. A few minutes later, Daniel joined her. They spoke quietly, but the hallway carried sound surprisingly well. "The guest room should probably become an office," Heather said. "And this space would be perfect for built-in shelves." Daniel nodded. "We could finally open up the wall between the dining room and kitchen." They spoke about the house as though they already owned it. Not once did either of them mention me. Not once did they ask what I wanted. I returned to my bedroom and closed the door softly. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room Robert and I had shared for decades. The framed photograph from our first anniversary still sat on the dresser. His favorite novel rested on the nightstand. The quilt folded neatly across the foot of the bed had been made by my mother nearly 40 years earlier. Every object carried a memory. Every corner held part of a life that had been built patiently over time. Yet downstairs, plans were already being made as though those memories had no value at all. That evening, Heather suggested ordering takeout for dinner. During the meal, she seemed unusually cheerful. She asked about neighborhood property values. She asked whether I had ever considered moving closer to a retirement community. She even mentioned a newly developed senior living campus about 15 miles away. The questions were wrapped in kindness, but the intention beneath them felt increasingly obvious. I answered politely and changed the subject whenever possible. The less I reacted, the more confident she seemed to become. After dinner, Daniel mentioned that he might take a few vacation days from work soon. "There will probably be a lot to organize after everything is settled," he said. Heather smiled immediately. Exactly. Neither of them explained what they meant by settled. They did not need to. Later that night, I passed the guest room and noticed the door was slightly open. Heather was sitting on the bed with a notebook in her lap. Several pages were covered with lists. I only caught a brief glance as I walked by, but I recognized enough words to understand the general theme. Furniture, contractors, storage, moving expenses, future projects. I continued down the hallway without making a sound. By then, their confidence had become almost remarkable. They were not simply hoping for a particular outcome. They were preparing for it. The following morning, the house felt unusually busy. Heather dressed carefully for the meeting. Daniel appeared nervous but optimistic. They exchanged quiet conversations over breakfast and checked their phones repeatedly. I drank my coffee slowly and listened to the grandfather clock mark each passing minute. For some reason, I felt calmer than anyone else in the house. Perhaps it was because I had stopped worrying about what others expected. Robert had spent months preparing something. Thomas had made that clear. Whatever happened later that day, I knew one thing with certainty. My husband had never been careless. And if everyone around me was celebrating before the truth was revealed, there was a very good chance they had celebrated far too soon. By the time we arrived at Thomas Bennett's office, the parking lot was nearly full. Several relatives had already gathered inside. I recognized cousins I had not spoken to in years, along with a nephew who had somehow managed to miss every holiday gathering for nearly a decade. Yet somehow, everyone had found time for this meeting. As I stepped into the conference room, conversations softened. Polite smiles appeared. Chairs shifted. People greeted me with sympathy, but there was something else beneath the surface. Curiosity. Anticipation. I took my seat near the end of the long oak table and placed my purse beside me. Across the room, Heather looked perfectly composed. Her cream-colored blazer was neatly pressed, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone attending a celebration rather than a legal proceeding. Daniel sat beside her. He appeared more nervous than excited, but every time Heather leaned over to whisper something, he seemed to relax again. The room slowly filled. Coffee cups rested on side tables. Papers rustled. A distant siren echoed through the city streets below the office windows. Then Thomas entered carrying several folders. The conversation stopped immediately. He greeted everyone politely before taking his place at the head of the table. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any conversation. Thomas adjusted his glasses and opened the first folder. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Today we will review the final wishes and estate instructions prepared by Robert Callahan." Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud tightened something inside my chest. For a brief moment, the legal meeting disappeared, and all I could think about was the man I had spent 42 years loving. I pictured him standing in our backyard on summer evenings. I pictured him reading in his favorite chair. I pictured the quiet smile he always gave me before leaving for work. Grief still lived inside those memories, but so did strength. Thomas began with several routine matters. Personal acknowledgments. Small gifts designated for certain relatives. Charitable donations Robert had arranged years earlier. The room listened politely, though I noticed that many people seemed distracted. They were waiting for larger answers. Heather checked her watch twice within 10 minutes. Daniel crossed and uncrossed his arms repeatedly. One cousin leaned forward every time Thomas turned a page. The atmosphere reminded me of an audience waiting for the final act of a play. As the reading continued, I noticed something interesting. Thomas never rushed. He moved carefully through every section, giving each instruction the attention it deserved. Occasionally, he paused to clarify a detail or answer a procedural question. Each pause seemed to increase the tension around the room. Heather eventually stopped smiling altogether. Instead, she stared directly at the folders in front of Thomas. Her focus was intense, almost hungry. Then Thomas reached for a different document. The motion was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. The room seemed to notice as well. Several relatives straightened in their chairs. Daniel leaned forward. Heather folded her hands together and fixed her eyes on the attorney. Thomas glanced around the table before speaking. The next section concerns the primary estate holdings and long-term family provisions. The words settled over the room like a sudden change in weather. No one moved. No one spoke. Every expectation, every assumption, every private plan appeared to narrow toward that single moment. I remained silent, remembering Robert's voice from months earlier. "Trust the papers." Across the table, Heather looked absolutely certain of what was about to happen. And for the first time all morning, I found myself wondering how she would react if she were wrong. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire room. Thomas looked down at the document for a moment before continuing. His voice remained calm and measured, but every person at the table was listening more carefully now. Robert Callahan directed that all primary estate assets, including the family residence, investment accounts, savings holdings, and ownership interests, be placed under the sole control of his wife, Margaret Callahan. For a second, nobody reacted. It was as though the words had not fully registered. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath somewhere across the table. Heather blinked several times. Daniel's expression froze. Thomas continued reading before anyone could interrupt. These assets are to remain under Margaret Callahan's exclusive authority for the duration of her lifetime. A cousin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another relative glanced toward Daniel. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was beginning to disappear. I remained still. My hands rested quietly in my lap. Inside, however, memories rushed through my mind. The afternoons Robert spent in his office, the meetings with Thomas, the conversations on the porch. Every piece was beginning to fit together. Heather finally spoke. "I am sorry," she said carefully. "Could you repeat that section?" Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Certainly." He repeated the provision exactly as written. This time the words landed with unmistakable clarity. The house belonged to me. The accounts remained under my control. The decisions were mine. Not Daniel's. Not Heather's. Mine. Heather's smile had vanished completely. Daniel looked down at the table as though searching for an explanation hidden within the wood grain. Yet Thomas was not finished. He turned another page and continued reading. "The estate shall also establish a family trust. Future distributions to beneficiaries will be determined according to the conditions outlined by Robert Callahan." The room became silent again. I noticed several relatives leaning forward. Everyone understood that an important condition was coming. Thomas read directly from the document. "Any beneficiary who attempts to pressure, manipulate, isolate, remove, or otherwise interfere with Margaret Callahan's independence, housing decisions, financial authority, or personal well-being shall immediately forfeit their rights to future distributions from the trust." The effect was immediate. Several people exchanged stunned looks. One relative actually sat back in his chair and folded his arms. Heather's face lost its color. Daniel stared straight ahead without speaking. The condition was remarkably specific. Too specific to be accidental. Robert had anticipated something. Perhaps not every detail, but enough to address it directly. Thomas continued. "Such forfeited distributions shall be redirected to charitable organizations selected by Margaret Callahan." No one interrupted him this time. There was nothing left to say. The document spoke for itself. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, gratitude, sadness. Above all, admiration for the man I had loved. Robert had understood something I had only recently begun to see. He knew that money could change people. He knew that assumptions could grow into expectations. Most importantly, he knew that protecting someone was not always about providing wealth. Sometimes it was about preserving dignity. Across the table, Heather lowered her eyes. Daniel remained silent. For weeks they had spoken about plans, renovations, and future decisions as though the outcome was already theirs. Now the reality before them looked very different. Thomas closed the folder and placed both hands on the table. The room remained completely still. At that moment, nobody was looking at the documents anymore. They were looking at me. No one spoke for several seconds after Thomas closed the folder. The silence felt different now. Earlier, it had been filled with expectation. Now it was filled with realization. One by one, relatives looked away from me and toward the documents resting on the table. The answers they had come searching for were no longer hidden. Everything was perfectly clear. I sat quietly in my chair and took a slow breath. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. Mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that Robert had understood the situation better than I had. Grateful that he had protected not only our assets, but my ability to live with dignity. Heather was the first person to break eye contact. She lowered her gaze to the table and folded her hands together. The confidence she had carried into the room was gone. Daniel looked older somehow. Not physically, but emotionally. The certainty he had been carrying for weeks seemed to have disappeared in a matter of minutes. Thomas gathered several papers and distributed copies to those who needed them. The meeting continued briefly as procedural details were explained. Most people listened politely, though the energy in the room had completely changed. Conversations that once seemed eager now felt restrained. Assumptions had been replaced by facts. When the meeting finally ended, chairs slid back and people slowly began leaving the conference room. A few relatives approached me to offer condolences and polite words before departing. Others avoided conversation altogether. I remained seated for a moment, collecting my purse and organizing my thoughts. Daniel eventually walked toward me. For the first time all day, Heather remained several feet behind him. My son looked uncomfortable. "Mom," he said quietly. I did not realize. His voice faded before the sentence was finished. I looked at him and saw something I had not seen in weeks. Uncertainty. Not about money. About himself. "Your father loved you very much," I said. "Nothing in that document changes that." Daniel nodded slowly. He looked as though he wanted to say more, but no words came. Sometimes silence says enough. Heather remained standing near the doorway. She offered a brief smile that never fully formed. I returned a polite nod. There was no argument, no confrontation, no dramatic scene. None was necessary. The truth had already spoken. Outside the building, the afternoon sun reflected from the windows of nearby offices. Traffic moved steadily through downtown streets. People hurried past carrying coffee cups and briefcases, unaware that an entire family dynamic had shifted inside a conference room several stories above them. I stood on the sidewalk and looked toward the sky. For the first time since Robert's passing, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. Not because I had gained control of assets. Not because anyone else had lost something. The relief came from knowing that Robert's faith in me had never wavered. He had trusted me to continue living my life on my own terms. In the weeks that followed, the house remained exactly where it had always been. The photographs stayed on the walls. The maple tree continued changing colors outside the porch. The memories remained untouched. Some relationships required time to heal. Others revealed truths that could not be ignored. But I learned something important through the entire experience. People often believe power comes from money, property, or influence. Robert understood something different. Real power comes from character. It comes from patience. It comes from knowing who you are when everyone else has already decided who they think you should be. They thought I was powerless because I was grieving. They thought I was powerless because I was older. They thought I was powerless because I sat quietly and said very little. What they never understood was that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is confidence. And sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who never needed to raise her voice at all.